Who'd have thought that God would get angry at the worship of his people? Who'd have thought that God would say, "This just isn't good enough"? Well, it happened, and here's why. Now, this is an important story, the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. And we know it's important because other than the first Easter, there are only two other stories that are actually recorded in all four Gospels: the feeding of the 5,000 and the cleansing of the temple. So if Matthew, Mark, Luke and John all recorded the story, then we know it must be really important. But they don't all tell it in the same way. In Matthew, Mark and Luke, the story of the cleansing of the temple comes during Holy Week at the very end of Jesus' life. But in John's Gospel, the story comes right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry instead. Probably, in terms of history, Matthew, Mark and Luke were right. It probably did happen during the final week of Jesus' life. And this event was the last straw for the religious leaders, and it was actually the reason why they decided that Jesus had to be killed, because he was now threatening the very fabric of the religious institution. But John puts it at the beginning of his Gospel, because the cleansing of the temple for John is a sort of metaphor for the whole of Jesus' ministry. John believed that Jesus had come to renew religion, to challenge the institutional view of God and to bring passion and purity back into the worship of God. The Jewish people had at that time lost their way, and they had lost their heart for God, and they seemed to be just going through the motions when it came to temple worship and the way they ordered society. And I wonder if that is true for you and me as well. Are we as passionate for God now as we once were? Or are we going through the motions whenever we engage with church? Have we lost the fire in our bellies for mission and evangelism? And have we put God in a box in our lives to be brought out whenever we've got a bit of time to fit him in? Well, if so, the story of Jesus cleansing the temple is really challenging for us. So let's think about what's going on here. Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the Passover, and when Jesus arrived in the city, there would have been thousands of people there, a huge crowd crammed into the narrow city streets, and an incredible bustle and noise in the temple itself, a really chaotic scene, but a thrilling experience, of course, for everyone who was there. And of course, it was peak business for all the religious traders, selling lambs and oxen and pigeons for the sacrifices, and appropriate food to eat, and all the other bits and pieces that would be associated with temple worship. And Jesus walked into the temple, into the midst of all the chaos and all the noise and the hustle and bustle, and he looked around him at all the pilgrims and the prayerful, the tradesmen and the touts, and his emotions rose to fever pitch. Now, Jesus didn't get caught up in the heat of the moment. We read in verse 15 that Jesus made a whip of cords. So he clearly took time to reflect and then to take time to make the whip. The cleansing of the temple wasn't done in the heat of the moment. And then the anger of Jesus becomes evident. He drove out the sheep. He drove out the cattle. He scattered the money all over the floor. He overturned the tables. He threw out the dove sellers. No one was spared the anger of Jesus in that moment. And then he shouts,
"How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?"
This act of Jesus is an act of disruption, not disrupting the events of that day in the temple, but an act of disruption that cuts to the core of the historic Jewish faith and all that it stood for. This is a moment of crisis, not for the dove sellers and the money changers. There would always be more doves to sell, there'd always be more money and currency to trade, but this was a moment of crisis for the people of God. Jesus was saying that the old way of doing faith was no longer appropriate, that the heart of faith had been lost in the ritualism, that it was passion for God that had sold out, not pigeons for sacrifice. So Jesus is confronting the people of God with a deeply uncomfortable truth, and this was a moment for them to reassess. It wasn't enough for them to be tied to their ritualism. They needed to rediscover the heart of their faith and let that shape their worship. But don't think that Jesus was opposed to Jewish ritualism and Jewish tradition. He wasn't. Jesus was a Jew. He was born and brought up as a Jew. He was steeped in the law and the ways of the synagogue and the temple. And it was because he was a committed Jew, not in spite of it, that Jesus overturned the tables in the temple. Jesus was acting in the line of the Jewish prophets, in the line of Micah, who hundreds of years before had written this: "Will God be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? God has told you what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Jesus was acting in the line of Amos, who said these words: "Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, says God. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an everlasting stream." Jesus was acting in the line of the prophet Jeremiah, who said this: "Do not trust in the deceptive words, 'This is the temple of the Lord,' but act justly. Do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Do not go after other gods. Then I will be with you in this place." So Micah knew, and Amos knew, Jeremiah knew, and Jesus knew that true faith cannot be expressed through empty rituals, but that the rituals we undertake in acts of worship must be an expression of the real worship of our lives, which is to pursue justice, kindness, humility, non-oppression, care for the marginalised, faithfulness and righteousness. If our worship in a church building or online does not reflect these attitudes and actions, then it's not really true worship at all. God is not primarily interested in beautiful worship. He's interested in pure worship, and the two can be very different indeed. So by the time Jesus visited the temple on that day for worship, the Jewish nation had lost sight of the difference between beautiful worship and pure worship. The purity rituals had become rituals of discrimination. Jews in the inner court, Gentiles in the outer court, men in this section, women in that section, sacrifices the poor could afford, sacrifices that only the rich could afford. In the beauty of the ritual, the heart of purity had been lost, and that had made Jesus angry, and as a prophet he had to make a stand. So Jesus stood in the line of the prophets, calling for his religious institutions to let go of beauty and embrace instead compassion and acceptance and love for the marginalised. And if we are to take worship seriously, we must make sure that what we do on a Sunday in our worship reflects the values that we hold the rest of the week. Our true worship is worked out on Monday to Saturday as we care for the vulnerable and the weak and the hurting, as we share the good news of God's love with our neighbours and work colleagues and college colleagues and whoever else we meet, as we model the forgiveness and patience of Christ within our own families. That is our worship. That is the worship that God requires of us. And what we do on a Sunday is a summing up, if you like, a bringing together of all of that. Jesus said, didn't he, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another." So we are to join with Christ in the line of the prophets and pursue true worship, pure worship. As Micah reminds us, what the Lord requires of you is to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So fulfilling that command must be our priority. It must be our life's work, because that is at the heart of our worship. And when we come together with our brothers and sisters in Christ, the honour that we show to God through our hymns and our prayers and our songs and our sermons and our liturgies will have real depth and meaning, because we will have been living it out every day of the week before, and we will commit to living it out every day of the week to come. So perhaps the temple in this story is a metaphor for your life, for your worship. Does Jesus need to come and visit you in an act of cleansing? If so, invite him in and be renewed by him, so that your whole life can be an act of worship 7 days a week.